All right. Okay. I think we're almost there. So we're live now, I believe. Shalom, everyone. I'm Brother Doug with my mom, Sister Sharon, and Brother Yahusha, and Sister Marissa, and Brother Dennis. And we are the Wakened by Yahuwah Assembly and Yahuwah Almighty Yahushua Messiah. Today we are um, going to do a study called New Testament Quotes from the Septuagint or that match the Septuagint. So these are going to be specific verses and cross references that only match the Septuagint rather than the traditional modern Hebrew text that's in your Old Testaments today in most of your translations. So I think first we're going to go to, and let me just pull up my document here on my other device here so I can kind of multitask here. Let's go to Google Docs here. As usual, guys, I'm going to try my best to give you the doc in the description of the video so you guys can look into it yourselves. First one I'm going to show that is pretty very important is Hebrews 1:6 because this shows Yahusha being Yahuwah here outright, and Paul's calling him the Father outright. Okay, Hebrews 1:6 says, "Let all the messengers worship him." And if we want to read the whole verse, we can do so. Go ahead, Mom. I see you're already there.
And again, when Alua brings his firstborn into the world, he says, "Let all Yahuwah's angels worship him." In speaking of the angels, says, "He makes his angels winds, his servants flames of fire." Just those
Yep.
two verses.
Yep. Actually, only the first verse. Okay. So we're focusing on the messengers worshiping Yahusha, and Yahuwah is actually it's claiming here that Yahuwah is telling the messengers to worship him, commanding the messengers to worship Yahusha, which means that Yahusha can't be a separate person.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's go to Deuteronomy 32, 43.
Yeah.
Now, some of your footnotes,
Yeah, that was my footnote.
Will tell you this in your if you have like an NIV study Bible or an NLT study Bible or a King James study Bible, your footnote might let you know the Masoretic doesn't have this in Deuteronomy 32. Not all of them do. Oh, go ahead.
You mentioned that the verse that it says, "Let all the messengers worship him," and that he can't be a separate person. Based off that verse, um, what would you say to like someone like Kingdom in Context who would um argue that?
I would say then you're promoting polytheism. Literally, you are promoting
His
that
his argument is that it's allowed because the Father commanded it.
Then you have to throw out Exodus 20. And then that means the messengers can do something we can't. Because Yahuwah says, "What? Have no other mighty ones before me." That includes the Son. If Yahushua is another mighty one, you are literally going against the Ten Commandments. Literally. This is why the oneness, like you and I both agree, the oneness concept is a lot more important than people realize. They scoff at it. But if you don't understand the oneness, you are by default a polytheist. You're saying it's God A and God B. You know, deity one, deity two, thing one, thing two. And that's not how Yahuwah's Torah works. You can't, if Yahushua is a separate entity, separate mighty one, or the Christians want to say God, okay, lowercase God, whatever, like the Jehovah Witnesses, you're a polytheist. I mean, that's just what a spade a spade. Call a spade a spade. It's polytheism. But I'm going to show you here how you can combat someone like Kingdom in Context, literally in the Septuagint here, because it's calling him the Father here, and I'm going to show you how he can make that argument by looking at Hebrews 1:6 alone, but he can't make that argument looking at the Septuagint. I'll show you here, because this is exactly where Paul's quoting from. It says, "Rejoice, you heavens, with him, and let all the angels of Elohim worship him." Who's the him here? The Father. Okay? So Paul is calling the first begotten or firstborn of Yahuwah himself. It's not just worshiping the Son, it's that the Son is the Father, if you get what I'm saying. So because the Septuagint, if you look at verse 42, it's talking about the Father and his relationship with Israel. Then you go into verse 43, rejoice ye heavens with him meaning Yahuwah. And let all the angels of Elohim worship him, meaning Yahuwah. Rejoice you Gentiles with his people. And let all the sons of Elohim strengthen themselves in him. So the problem is that people are taking Hebrews 1:6 of itself. If you combine it with Deuteronomy 32:43, Paul is in so facto calling Yahusha the same person as Yahuwah. There's no argument that can be made. So either you're going to reject the Septuagint, or you're going to try to play mental gymnastics with Hebrew 1:6, which I don't recommend doing. But either way, it says what it says. So you can't get around that, because he's calling the firstborn of Yahuwah the same person as the person in Deuteronomy 32:43, which is told the messengers are being told to worship, which is the Father, because you can go throughout the whole chapter, it's mentioning the Father the whole time. There's no reason that it switches to another person in verse 43. So, and there's another verse that we can go to about that to combat people like Kingdom in Context is Psalms, where Yahuwah outright, and I guess that's his argument, is the Psalms verse. I could see his argument for the Psalms verse where Yahuwah says, he tells all, your throne, O Elohim, and all that. I could see him saying, well, the Father is telling them to worship him, so yada, yada, yada. But in this place here, it's not even doing that. It's actually, Paul is equating Yahusha with Yahuwah in this reference. He is literally saying that the messengers are worshiping Yahuwah, and then he's saying in Hebrews 1:6 from that quote that Yahusha is the one they're worshiping. So messengers can't be worshiping two different mighty ones. It's not, So that would be my response to people like Kingdom in Context, is that you're not taking stuff in context. No pun intended there, but you're not taking stuff in context. So if you look at Hebrews 1:6, Deuteronomy 32 verse 43, clearly it's calling the Son the Father. It's saying they're one person. So, and there's many other verses that we can go to, like Genesis 18. We clearly understand that that's Yahusha pre-incarnate coming to Abraham, but it says Yahuwah in Genesis 18. I mean, there's tons of stuff like this. Genesis 19, we can even go to where it says Yahuwah on the earth rained down Sodom and Gomorrah from Yahuwah that is in heaven. I mean, there's tons of places that Yahusha is being given the same esteem as the Father if he's another entity. That is sin, that is idolatry. Yahuwah is not going to tell his messengers to sin. To me, that argument just doesn't hold up. It just doesn't. So anyway, but I know like people that are non-oneness, I forget if they're called Arianism or whatever they're called, they try to go around these verses, especially from the Septuagint. They don't want to use the Septuagint because the Septuagint has stuff like this. It has stuff showing that Yahusha is the Father. And you can see this more clearly in the Septuagint. So the Masoretic just has this missing. That's another reason I brought this up. Just it's not there. It's not there at all. Like you can, in the Masoretic version, I think all it talks about is rejoice ye heavens. Let's see here. I'll go to the King James here. Rejoice ye nations. Doesn't even say heavens. Leaves that out. With his people, for he will avenge the blood of his servants. So completely leaves that out about worship. Completely leaves it out about the messengers worshiping Yahusha, because most likely the Masoretes knew who it was talking about. They knew about Paul's letters. They knew about, and that's another thing too, is that these Masoretes knew who Yahusha was claiming to be. It's not like this is a huge revelation in 1000 AD. They knew who Yahusha claimed to be when Yahusha was on the earth. They had these traditions from their, forefathers about what Yahusha said, and we know the New Testament attests to what Yahusha said to the Pharisees. These Masoretes knew this. That's why they took it out. They knew this. So, to try to say that Yahusha's not claiming to be Yahuwah, or that he's still a separate person from Yahuwah in this verse, then why would they take it out? Doesn't make any sense. That, that's, to me, that would be like opposite of their agenda. So if he's not if the verse is not claiming that he's the Father. So anyway, but anyway, so Deuteronomy 32:43 is missing that. There's a lot of other things Deuteronomy 32 is missing in the Masoretic, like verse 8. Even though that's not part of this topic, verse 8 is completely leaving out the heavenly council concept by changing a later Hebrew manuscript, whatever the Masoretes used, changed the word agelos theos of the Greek to B'nai Yisrael. So same chapter, that verse, they completely changed that verse, and the Dead Sea Scrolls would say B'nai Elohim, not Yisrael. The Septuagint says messengers of Elohim. So again, they're intentionally changing things. Whatever source the Masoretes had was intentionally changing things. It was not accidental. So the next one we have is Mark 7, 6-7, which this is a change. It may be, people will argue that this is not that big of a change, but it is big enough to where the New Testament verse does not match the Masoretic quote. So it says, he said to them, well, did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as is written, these people honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. Verse 7, in vain do they worship me, teaching instructions that are commandments of humans. Okay, so Mark 7:7 is quoting from Isaiah 29:13, which if you look in the Septuagint is word for word. Okay, this is one of the places it's easy to see that Yahusha quoted from a Septuagint. Yahuwah has said, this people draw near to me with their mouth, and they honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. But in vain do they worship me, teaching the commandments and doctrines of men. Now, if you look at the Masoretic, it will just say, their fear of me is like is like a commandment of men that is written. So like it's talking about that the fear of Yahuwah is more of a commandment of men, the way they fear Yahuwah. They're just fearing Yahuwah because they're taught to. That's what the Masoretic is saying. It's a completely different concept. Completely different. Like hugely different. Let's see here. I think the next one is Mom, could you read let's see here. Hebrews 10:5 for me. So this should be a really big deal here. This is about the incarnation. This is about Yahusha taking on flesh. This is a big verse here. So Hebrews 10:5.
Therefore, when Messiah came into the world, he said, sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but a body you prepared for me.
Oh, yep. Yep. So again, a body you have prepared for me. If you have a Masoretic text, Old Testament, and you go to that verse he quotes from, it will say, you have opened my ears. That is nowhere near what Paul is quoting from. Paul is quoting from the Septuagint. And if you go to Psalms 40, verse 6, you'll see he's quoting it word for word. Okay. The voice of one, oh, sorry. Oh, not Isaiah. What the heck? Psalms 46. Sacrifice and offering you would not, but a body you have prepared for me.
Mhm.
Whole burnt offering and sacrifice you did not require. So it's practically word for word there. Um, so let's see here. We got okay. So far we're seeing how a lot of these have to do with the messianic prophecies. A lot of these have to do with the coming Messiah, who Yahushua was and is. So a lot of this has to do with either validating Yahushua as the Messiah or the Masoretes changing things to invalidate him. Now I just want to check something real quick. I want to see if the Vulgate, what if they have a second witness to this. Sometimes the Vulgate actually agrees with the Septuagint. Nah. So that means the earliest you have the reading as the reading of ears in that verse,
Yeah.
the earliest they could have possibly had it was the second or third century AD, because the Vulgate is agreeing here. It's saying, "Sacrifice and oblation you did not want, but you have perfected ears for me." So what's happening here is the Vulgate's already corrupting it. Now the Vulgate would have used some type of, you know, second, third century manuscript AD. So that's Jerome's text. So Jerome is using a Hebrew text that is corrupted.
I have an interesting footnote. It says, instead of that, it says, but a body you have prepared for
Yeah.
me. And it says, see also Bacchus and Theodotion.
Theodotion is a scholar, a Circe scholar that he had to do certain books of the LXX that got really fragmented.
Oh,
So he's an author of some of these other Greek versions. Like he has his own Greek Daniel. I think in the Lexham. Hold on. Do you have the Lexham on you, Mom?
no, I don't,
Okay.
honey.
Because in the Lexham English Septuagint, in the contents, it will talk about LXX Daniel and then Theodotion Daniel.
Mm.
They might not call it Theodotion, but if you look into the index and all that, that's what it's talking about. The alternative Greek Daniel is Theodosian's Daniel. So Theodotion was very popular. He was a Circe father and scholar, very popular. But yeah, so but anyway, it's interesting that the Vulgate agrees with the Masoretic because that proves that there was some monkey business going on. So you already have in second, third century AD, which would have been what, like roughly 400 years or even more than that. Let's see here. Second to third century BC to second to third century AD, that's already like what, 1,000 years almost? Or let me try to correct myself here. 600. Sorry, guys, 600. So 600 years later, they're already corrupting stuff. So anyway, so let's go back to the document here. Luke 4:17, open the eyes of the blind. And this, even though I know some people will say Isaiah 42 has it, most Bible apps will say the cross reference for this verse is not Isaiah 42, it's actually Isaiah 61. So even though there's a mentioning of opening the eyes of the blind in Isaiah 42:7, the verse in question here is Isaiah 61 verse 1. So if you look at Luke 4:17, it says to open the eyes of the blind, right? If you go to where it's quoting from, the Masoretic does not have that phrase, open the eyes of the blind. So that is completely missing from this messianic prophecy.
Yeah.
So, see here. Oh, sorry, 4:18. Sorry, Mom. misquoted it. Okay, but if you look here, Isaiah 61, verse 1. The Spirit of Yahuwah is upon me because he has anointed me to preach the good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom to the captives and opening eyes of the blind. Clearly missing in the Masoretic. And the New Heart English Bible says here, translator notes Dead Sea Scrolls agrees that it should say opening the eyes of the blind. So you have the LXX and the Dead Sea Scrolls saying that it should include that in Isaiah 61, verse 1, but it doesn't in the Masoretic. So again, these are intentional changes. These have to do with Yahusha, his ministry, giving sight to the blind, and all that. All right, so the next one we have is Matthew 12, verse 21. In his name, the Gentiles shall trust, right? Matthew 12, 21. Okay, this is a huge difference in my opinion. So then we go to Isaiah 42. I'll read it here. Isaiah 42, verse 4 is where he's quoting from. In the Septuagint, you will see this. It will say, he shall shine out, he shall not be discouraged until he has set right ruling on the earth, and in his name shall the Gentiles trust. Now, if you look at like any Masoretic version, it will say, and the isles shall wait for his law. Problem is, this is supposed to be talking about trusting in the name of the Messiah rather than the Torah, waiting for the Torah. I believe they changed this because, again, remember what the Masoretes believed. They were kind of like the Pharisees. They were like a later Pharisaical sect. They were the Pharisees. What did they say in the book of Acts? Stop teaching in his name. Okay? So this is intentional stuff. This is, again, and this actually foreshadows the book of Acts saying that they would trust in his name. And what do? They preach in the name of Yahusha, trust in his name. So there's only one name under heaven, Acts chapter 4, given among men that they must be saved. So again, these Masoretes knew this. That's why they took that phrase out. So that was Isaiah 42, verse 4. Romans 15:12. In him shall the Gentiles trust. And that is quoting from Isaiah 11:10. You want to read that, Mom, from Romans 15?
15:12? Okay.
Yeah.
And again, Isaiah says, the root of Jesse will spring up, one who will arise to rule over the nations. The Gentiles will hope in him.
Yep. So the Gentiles will trust in him or hope in him.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see here. So Isaiah 11:10 in the Septuagint says, in him shall the Gentiles trust, and his rest shall be esteemed. Now, if you look at the Masoretic of Isaiah 11:10, all it says is, to it shall the Gentiles seek, and his rest shall be esteemed. So you have the difference between actually trusting in the Messiah, the coming Messiah, versus just seeking for him, trying to find who he was. And this is what, like, if you ever watched like the JC of Nazareth series in the 70s, this is what the Pharisees were doing. They were trying to figure out who the Messiah was going to be. All they cared about was seeking for him. You know? So it was more about them with their head knowledge. Oh, okay, who's going to be the Messiah? This or that, this or that, this guy or that guy. So it was almost like the way Christianity tries to figure out who the next candidate for the Antichrist is going to be. It's kind of like similar to that. So that's all the Pharisees cared about. They cared about seeking for the Messiah rather than trusting in the Messiah. So again, that's an intentional. And what I find interesting is also part of that verse says the Gentiles will trust in him. So it seems like they're trying to take away any type of grafting in concept because the Septuagint version is saying that the Gentiles are going to trust in him. They're going to have faith in him. So to me, that's a little strange unless you're trying to get rid of the grafting in concept, possibly. So anyway, so moving on, Isaiah 8:14. All right, Isaiah 8:14. If you trust in him, Masoretic text omitted. 1 Peter 2:8 and 7. How about you read that, Mom? The
What's that?
First Peter chapter 2 verses 8 and verse 7, and I'll read the one from Isaiah. So we're getting close to the end here. This is a brief study, but it's a pretty important study.
Okay. They stumble because they disobey the message, which is also what they were destined for. And then 10.
Oh no, just chapter 2 verse 8 and 7. 7 to 8.
7 and 8.
Yeah,
Okay.
7 and 8.
Now,
Yeah.
to you who believe, this stone is precious. But to those who do not believe, the stone the builders rejected has become the capstone, and a stone that causes men to stumble, and a rock that makes them fall. They stumble because they disobey the message, which is also what they were destined for.
Interesting. That's a whole nother topic to get into, but that would seem to indicate that certain people are destined not to accept the good news.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. So let's see here. But in all seriousness here, it says those who believe in him, right, are not put to shame and all that.
Mm-hmm.
In 1 Peter 2:7 to 8. Okay, so notice in the Isaiah 8:14 here says the same thing. You will not. So it says here in the Septuagint of Isaiah 8:14, if you shall trust in him, he shall be to you for a set apart place, and you shall not come against him as against a stumbling stone. So in layman's terms, it's saying if you trust in him, he will be a safe place for you rather than a stone of stumbling. Which is again, 1 Peter 2:8 to 7, or I'm sorry, 2:7 to 8 is quoting from here. Now, if you look at the Masoretic, look at what they leave out here. And he shall be for a sanctuary, but for a stone of stumbling, for a rock of offense to both the houses of Israel. It's like he shall be a sanctuary, but to whom?
It makes no sense.
Like
It's
what?
an incomplete thought. It makes no sense.
Who is he a sanctuary for? It doesn't even tell you that. What? So, with all seriousness here, like, come on, you're telling me that's a mistake? That they didn't do that on purpose? Come on. This is clearly talking about those that are going to trust in him. He will be a sanctuary. And they will not come against him as a stumbling stone, meaning he's a stumbling stone for those that have no faith. Okay, that's who is predestined there in 1 Peter 2:7 to 8 was the Pharisees. They were predestined not to accept him. So it's like it completely changes the meaning there by taking that out, and it makes an incomplete thought, an incomplete sentence. It makes no sense. Too bad I don't have a Vulgate. Oh, I do have a Vulgate of Isaiah. Let me just see what Vulgate says here. I'm curious.
That'd be
Yeah, they
interesting.
were already changing it back then. They were already changing it. And so shall he be a sanctification to you. So they were already starting changes there. And then eventually it became, he will be a sanctuary. So they were already changing it in Jerome's day. That's really bad. They were already changing it back then. So third century, it was already changed. So again, like I said, 600 years after the original Septuagint, these Hebrew scribes, these new Hebrew scribes, were making modern Hebrew copies and distorting them. So that's why when I tell people, people say, "Oh, it's the Septuagint." They'll say it's you're taking the Septuagint over the Hebrew scriptures. I have to correct them. I'm like, no, I'm taking the Septuagint over a modern Hebrew corruption. If we're going to be honest here, it's a corruption. It's not the original Paleo Hebrew scriptures. So I make it very clear when I address people like that. We're not taking a Greek over the original Hebrew scriptures. We're taking a Greek translation of the original Hebrew over modern Hebrew corruption. That's the reality. And I know that might hurt people's feelings that are so pro-Masoretic, but the reality is you're trusting in people that don't have Yahuwah's spirit in them. That's the people that wrote the Masoretic text. They are agents of the devil, okay, outright, because they reject Yahusha. They don't have the spirit of Yahuwah in them, okay. They made the Masoretic text versus Yahudim of the second, third century BC, who actually knew their original Hebrew language, translated straight into Greek so accurately that every room from their translation, what they would do is they translated it. I think there was like at least for every person that had their own copy of the original Septuagint, they had to go from room to room to check to make sure there was no funny business going on.
Right.
And it all ended up being equal. All the 72 translators had a translation that was 110% equal. Hence why they believed it was a divine translation. Because you're telling me men of themselves with sinful nature in them would not differ from one another normally. There's so many proofs about that, the story of the Septuagint, that it was inspired. So anyway, um, Isaiah 49 verse 6, a great thing versus least thing. I find it interesting too. They try to belittle his purpose. That's what pisses me off too. They change it from a great thing to a small thing, right? Yours says small thing, right?
It is too small a thing for you to
Too
do.
small a thing. Thanks, Mazarites. Thanks. Oh, I guess salvation doesn't mean much. Okay. Okay. And yes, I'm being facetious right now because this pisses me off. Isaiah 49:6, it is a great thing for you to be called my servant, to establish the tribes of Jacob, to recover the dispersion of Yashrael. So Yahusha is the one to recover the dispersion of Yashrael. Behold, I have given you for the covenant of an ethnicity, for a light of the Gentiles, that you should be for salvation to the end of the earth. Oh, I wonder why they changed great to little thing. Wonder why. And again, this is why when people try to defend the Masoretic to me and they say, "Oh, these guys just, they didn't have the original." Who cares? They're using copies that were so corrupted. You're telling me that's not on purpose? They couldn't be that dumb to not realize these things were corruptions. Okay? You're gonna actually believe that Yahuwah would say something about his suffering servant. Oh, this is a little thing to bring salvation? Come on.
They're going to pay for that.
That's
They are going to
ridiculous.
pay for that.
I'm sorry. If no one sees a big deal with that in Isaiah 49 verse 6, I don't know what to tell you. I'm done at that point. I don't know what to tell you. So I'm sorry, but I get fired up about this. I get pissed off about this. It's like, Isaiah 7:14. Oh, not Isaiah, my bad. Acts 7:14. So this is going to talk about now we're switching gears to still just as important historical facts of scripture. How many sons of Jacob went down into Egypt? And this is like very convoluted. I understand that there is verses even in the LXX that get it wrong. I get that. I understand. But I'm saying for this topic, the majority of the cross references you'll see in the LXX for this verse in Acts 7 say 75 instead of 70. Okay, so if you look at Acts 7:14, it will say 75 souls went down to Egypt, right? Exodus 1:5 in the LXX says 75. Genesis 46:27 says 75. So the Masoretic in those two Tanakh verses say 70. So again, this is why I say this is not unintentional. They're constantly changing things or they're using corrupted verses. Okay. Let me just see if the Vulgate, what they say in those verses. I'm just curious. Because I know there are certain things that the Vulgate agrees with the LXX. I liked it all of a sudden. Every once in a while. Oh.
But Brother Doug, would the 70 mean anything to do with the 70 nations, you think? And that's
No,
why they try to change it to 75 to exclude the 70 nations?
it could be that. I know that eventually they started eventually going away from the heavenly council idea and they started like trying to substitute Israel with the principalities of the 75 nations. So yeah, I think there could be a possible agenda to that. I think also there's something I looked into the genealogy of Joseph and his family when you get to the later parts of Genesis. It seems like they're trying to hide something. They're trying to hide um, that Joseph would have still had not Joseph, that his dad would have still had a couple more children from concubines, if I remember correctly. So that's like a whole big other topic is about the when you look at Genesis 46 and all that, how they try to hide, especially Christian translations try to hide that there's concubines and stuff like that. And some of the children being born at that time were not from Joseph or the sons, that some of them were from the concubines of the dad, if I'm not mistaken. So there's a lot of there's a lot of stuff being hidden there from people because of the the anti-polygamous Western culture and all that. But yeah, the 75, you could have a point to that it could have something to do with the nations, possibly. I would say more to do with the 75 nations that are supposed to have a messenger for each nation. When Deuteronomy 32 talks about that, they changed the phrase sons of Elohim to Bnei Yisrael in the Masoretic. That's why your Hallelujah scriptures or whatever in Deuteronomy 32 verse 8 says sons of Israel. So there could be a connection between that and this verse here. There could be a reason why they changed it to 75. But yeah, I don't even think there's an actual number they know of from back then. It was always contested whether it was 70 or 75 about the nations. I don't think anyone really had a definite number of how many nations came from the Tower of Babel. I don't remember. Even if you look at like Midrashes and Jasher and all that, I think like even the Midrashes disagree with one another. Like they don't know exactly whether it's 70 or 75. So, but there had to have been an agenda to change it to 70. I know sometimes the Masoretic text, when there's like seemingly contradictions between verses, they'll change the other verse so it seems like there's no contradictions. Like I'll give you an example, right, where it says in Exodus 13, right, where it talks about the Passover and unleavened bread. One verse will say you eat unleavened bread for 7 days, right? And then the verse prior to that, I think it's verse 5 or 6, says, for 6 days in the LXX, it says for 6 days you eat unleavened bread, and then on the seventh day there's a Sabbath or whatever. They wrongfully interpret that as the Septuagint is saying you only eat it for 6 days. So they changed that verse to agree with the next verse. So it's almost like they feel like they know better than what it's saying. Like they feel like they need to correct quote unquote things. But not fully understanding the verse, it's not really a contradiction. It's the fact that Yahuwah is saying, for 6 days you eat unleavened bread, and then you have a gathering. That's all it's saying. So it's not saying that you're not eating on the seventh day. It's not saying that. So they misunderstood that, and they changed the word 6 to 7 in Exodus 13:6. So the LXX would say 6 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the seventh day is a feast to Yahuwah. It's not that they're not eating on the seventh day. He's just basically making a statement that it's a high day on the seventh day. That's all it's saying. So I think the Masoretes at times, even when they meant well, they screwed up because they thought they knew better than the earlier scribes of the Septuagint. They thought they knew so much better, and they were, changing things for no reason. So it's like, they themselves were not perfect in their understanding of Scripture. You know, so that's the problem too. When you have scribes that are, puffed up and they think they're so great because they can copy things 110% accuracy, copyists. But if they don't understand Scripture, you're going to have stuff like that where they're on purpose changing things. So anyway, the reason everyone uses the Masoretic text today was basically due to the Masoretes being supposedly superior copyists, and that they never made a mistake, yada yada yada. And that if that's the case, then you can't say they made a mistake then.
Right, it was intentional.
Then the changes between LXX and the modern Hebrew
That's correct.
are intentional changes. You know what I'm saying? You can't have it both ways.
No.
If I go on Wikipedia and it's telling me that they had a reputation of being the perfect copyists of manuscripts, then if they're perfect at their job, that means they're intentionally changing things. Or they're intentionally using manuscripts that are corrupted. So, Anyway, going back to Isaiah 49, verse 6, we already talked about how the LXX says it was a great thing to bring salvation. Another interesting note there. The LXX says salvation. Masoretic text weirdly says my salvation. Now, I don't know why they would add the word my there, other than to, I guess, put extra emphasis. They felt the need to add the word my there to Isaiah 49, verse 6. But it's very weird because the New Testament quote doesn't have the word my there. So it's showing that the original Hebrew did not have that. The Masoretes decided to add that word there because Acts 13:47 just says salvation. I'll read it here. Acts 13:47. So, for Yahuwah has commanded us, saying, I have sent you to be the light of the Gentiles, that you should be for salvation unto the ends of the earth. So interesting that the apostles are interpreting what originally was said of Yahusha, I guess because, now Yahusha's ministry was over and he's ascended, that now they're taking the same ministry as Yahusha had. I get why they phrase it like that. Okay, commanded us. Oh yeah, because Yahusha told them to preach the good news. Yeah, okay. But interestingly, Acts 13 just says for salvation. So the verse in question is 49:6 that says my salvation. So again, it's like they're adding stuff to either they feel they need to put certain extra emphasis on things, which doesn't make sense why they have to do that. But anyway, that's what happened there. And again, we went through Acts 7:14 and about that there was originally 75 souls went down to Egypt, which again, even extra biblical literature actually agrees with the Septuagint. That is 75 over 70. FYI, if you want to know that. I'm not calling that extra biblical literature scripture. I'm just saying historically and culturally, books from the late BC time period still understood that it was 75 and not 70. Exodus 12:40, chapter 12, verse 40. The LXX Targum Samaritan Torah all agree, and it says that for 434 years, the children of Israel sojourned in Canaan and Egypt and Canaan. Masoretic text leaves out Canaan. So Acts chapter 7, verse 6 agrees with the LXX. 400 years from Abraham, 400 years between Abraham and giving of the Torah at Sinai. So I'm going to read that just to show you guys what I'm talking about, which, by the way, is kind of interesting. I wonder if Paul was referencing the Targum in this verse, because if you look at the Targum of Exodus 12, the Jonathan one, it mentions this about giving of the law and all that. So just something to mention. Or is this Stephen here, Mom?
Huh?
Is Stephen the one talking in Acts 7?
I believe so. Yes.
So
yes.
he might have been quoting from a Targum then.
Mhm.
Let me see here. See here. And Elohim spake on this wise, that his seed should sojourn in a strange land, and that they should bring them into bondage and entreat them evil for 400 years. So just to explain, it's not saying 400 years of slavery. It's saying that they're going to be in a strange land and be entreated badly and slaves for a total of 400 years. So I always understood that to mean half of that time they're slaves, half of the other time they're just sojourners, which you see that happening. For the first 200 and something years, Abraham was not a slave. He was not captive or anything.
Someone's
So,
unmuted.
oh, sorry. Sorry about that. I didn't realize that before. Okay, hold on. So just to explain what I was saying, I've always interpreted this prophecy here that Acts 7:6 is referring to. The 434 is a combination. It's not 434 years of slavery. It's you got 240 years that they were in Canaan, and then, or give or take, and then you had the rest of the 200 and something years they were actually slaves. So really, they were not slaves for 400 years at all. The reason we think that is because the Masoretic text, it leaves Canaan out. So with leaving Canaan out, then you think they're in Egypt and slaves for 400 and something years, if that makes any sense. So the sojourning of the children of Israel while they were in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan was 430 years. So basically, if you do the math, 430 years divided by 2, you would get the amount of years that they're in both Canaan and Egypt. And I just did the math here, 215 each. So for both lands, 215 each. Which, by the way, funny enough, the Jonathan Targum mentions that in its commentary in that verse. So he actually put it in there, 250 years for Canaan and Egypt. So the historical understanding was that was the original understanding of Exodus 12, verse 40. There was never an understanding of 400 years in one land, or that they were slaves for 400 years. That was not until later on the Masoretes came around and changed that verse. So let me just see here. There's another verse I wanted to kind of include in that too from the New Testament. I think it says from Moses to Abraham was 400 years. Because the Targum of Exodus 12:40 mentions this as well, believe it or not. Um, why is the New Testament not showing it? This is weird. Why does Paul say, okay, where does Paul mention it? Galatians. All right. Yeah, so this is kind of related here. So Galatians 3:17. This is what I mean. The law which came 430 years afterward does not annul a covenant previously ratified by Elua, so as to make the promise void. So what he's saying is the child of works, Ishmael, cannot annul what Yahuwah already made through the true seed of Abraham, which was Isaac, right? So he's the seed of the promise through Isaac. So that's what Yahuwah is saying through Paul. He's saying that promise was already made 430 years before the law came, right? So, and you'll see this. It's like I said, it's funny that this is mentioned in Exodus 12:40 in the Targum as well. So in that big paragraph in the Targum mentions this, the 430 years from the law, from Abraham till the law was given. And then, so Paul definitely knew the Targum.
Oh, yeah.
Is what I'm trying to say. He, being a former Pharisee, he definitely knew of other versions of the Torah, and he most likely was pulling from the Targum in multiple places, which actually agrees with the Septuagint in this light, is why I'm bringing it up. So the next one we have is 1 Peter 4:18. If the righteous are scarcely saved.
Yeah.
Now he's quoting from Proverbs 11, verse 31, which says the same thing. If the righteous are scarcely saved, where will the wicked and the sinner appear? Now, the Masoretic text has nothing of that in that verse in Proverbs 11. Actually, read that, Mom, if you can.
4:18.
Proverbs. I'm sorry.
Peter.
I'm sorry, Mom. I'm
That's
not trying
all
to
right.
confuse you. Proverbs 11, verse 31. We're almost done here.
All right. 31. If the righteous receive their due on earth, how much more the ungodly and the sinner?
So it's just talking about they received their due. So now we're due something because we obey Yahuwah. We see, that to me is almost like works based. It's like we're entitled to something because we're righteous. When if you actually think about it, Yahuwah made us to obey him. That was the whole purpose, right? Was that he wanted to spend time with his creation he loved and for us to serve him. So if we're created to serve him, why would we be do anything? You see what I'm saying? What are we do? Like, I don't know. Maybe I'm misinterpreting that Masoretic version, but it sounds like they're trying to say, well, we're so great and righteous, we're deserved something. Like,
Yeah.
what? That's almost like the same thing in Christianity with the spirit of entitlement. Oh, we deserve this mercy. No, you don't.
No.
From the time you're a baby, once you get to about the age of accountability, whenever that is, 5, 6, 7 years old, as a toddler, you're already sinning. So how if you're already breaking the Torah that young till the time you become a believer, how do you deserve anything? What we deserve is death. So anyway, so hopefully you guys get what I'm trying to say there. So how ridiculous that version is, what it's saying there is completely different. So again, the LXX version will say, if the righteous are scarcely saved, where will the wicked and sinner appear? And why that's important is it's showing that a lot of us, Yahuwah's people, we're only by his mercy, we're barely making it into the kingdom.
Right.
That's what it means, scarcely saved. So, and that basically it's saying the wicked and the sinner have no chance because even the people of Yahuwah are scarcely saved. So anyway, I think that's a big change they made. 2 Timothy 1:7. I'll read this, Mom, just so, because I'm going to have you stay in Proverbs.
Okay.
I'll have you stay in Proverbs just to make it easy on you. 2 Timothy 1:7. This is another quote people don't realize. Paul seems to be quoting from the Septuagint here, especially when you look at the King James here. So it says, for Yahuwah did not give us a spirit of fear, but of power and love and of a sound mind. Where, the King James will say self-control. Okay. So if you look at the phrase sound mind, go to Proverbs, Mom, chapter 9, verse 10. I'll have you read the Masoretic version first.
Yeah. All right. Okay. The fear of Yahuwah is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge of the set apart one is understanding.
Knowledge, huh? Interesting. The LXX actually says counsel, so that's a lot different.
That is a lot.
Now, this part that the Masoretic text is missing connects with Paul here. It says, "For to know the law is a character of a sound mind." Notice how 2 Timothy 1:7 says his spirit gives us a sound mind. But what is a sound mind defined of in Proverbs 9? To know the Torah. So essentially, Paul is saying in 2 Timothy 1:7, that spirit of Yahuwah gives you knowledge of his Torah, or gives you discernment of his law. So I think that's pretty important change that was made there. Amos 9:11 is the last one we have here. Amos 9:11, which says rest of mankind in the Septuagint, but in the Masoretic it will say the rest of Edom. You'll see how this weird changes the whole meaning of the verse. In that day I will raise up the tabernacle of David that is fallen, the rebuild ruins of it. I will set up the parts thereof that have been broken down, and will build it up as in the ancient days. For the remnant of men, verse 12 there, and all Gentiles upon whom my name is called, may earnestly seek me, says Yahuwah, who does all these things. So I apologize. It's actually verse 12 there. Now, if you look at the Masoretic, it says, they may possess the remnant of Edom. It's a lot different there. Then when you look at Acts 15, verse 17, it says the rest of mankind. So obviously, the book of Acts here is quoting the Greek here. Okay, it's saying that the residue or remnant of mankind may seek after Yahuwah and all the Gentiles upon whom my name is called, says Yahuwah, who does all these things. So I believe the theory here would be that the Masoretes wanted to take out any grafting in concept in that verse and wanted to focus on supposedly us getting Edom as a possession for whatever reason. So that's the major difference there. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this study today. Before we end, I know Brother Yahusha, you wanted to mention about the Greek differences with the Greek and the Hebrew.
So the throwing away the Greek Septuagint simply because it's Greek and going with a Hebrew copy, I mean, let alone the fact that, the Hebrew copy that we have is only dates back to 1000 BC. But if you go that route, it's extremely dangerous, because then you got to throw away the renewed covenant as well, because the only renewed we have the Aramaic, but I mean that's Babylonian Hebrew, right? And then we have the only renewed covenants that we have are Babylonian Aramaic and Greek. I mean, we have fragments of Hebrew copies of the renewed covenant, but even those aren't as old, so it's a dangerous route to go. Just discarding the Septuagint simply because it's Greek.
Yep. And really it's the closest to the original Hebrew as far as it is concerned. It's the closest link we have. Dead Sea Scrolls, like I'm pretty sure you were mentioning, is way too fragmented to use as a source. Part of the problem a lot of people don't understand about the what is it called? The Dead Sea Scrolls is that it's not all from the original Hebrew. There are certain things that are from the original Paleo there, but it's not as a whole the original Paleo Hebrew scriptures. it's, you know, it ranges. Even people that study in this area even admit you got certain scrolls from the 3rd century, certain scrolls from the 2nd century, 1st century. Some are from 100 AD. It's not the original scriptures. So I think people, even if we had a full-on Dead Sea Scrolls, like it was not fragmented at all, you would still have issues of what is originally from the original Paleo Hebrew scriptures and what is starting to become part of like the corruptions. Because according to many scholars like Michael Heiser, I'll just quote him, there's supposedly there's historical evidence that very shortly after Yahushua's ascension, they were making new Hebrew copies. They were already making altered Hebrew copies that differed on purpose from the original Hebrew and the Septuagint. So the thing is, as far as we know, at this moment in time, like you were saying, what we can hold in our hands, the Septuagint is the closest link to the original Hebrew scriptures. Whether people like that or they don't like that, I don't know what to tell you. It's the truth. So, you know, you can be mad all you want that Greek manuscript is our closest link to the original Hebrew scriptures, but that's just a fact. So I mean, that's just the way it goes. So, I mean, literally, and again, I just want to preface that the Masoretic text is not original Hebrew. I don't know how many times we've had to say this on the record here. It's not original Hebrew. There's a difference between box script and Paleo Hebrew. They're not the same language. So, go ahead, brother. And I know you're more varied in this topic than I am.
No, I just wanted to say real quick that we really need to use common sense, you know, because I see a lot where people will say that, well, I don't read the you know, they'll be reading the Masoretic text and they'll have like an app where, you know, it'll take the Masoretic and it'll change it back into Paleo, but it's still the same, you know, they're still reading from the same source just because what you see on your screen, like, okay, so how do I explain this? What Gil would used to do, he would take his My Sword or his eSword app, and he would have the Masoretic text on the screen in Hebrew, but he would have something that would change it back to Paleo. And so you would see Paleo on the screen. However, it's still the same source, you know. And he would argue with me, well, I'm not reading this with the Masoretic vowel points, but you're still reading the Masoretic text. It don't matter if you change the you know, what you see on the screen, you know, you're still reading from the same source. And so I see that where a lot of Yashral is just not using common sense. So please, you know, use common sense.
Yeah. And like, I'll give you an example, right? We talked about Deuteronomy 32:8 earlier, right? Whether you have the Paleo Hebrew showing on your app or the box script showing on that verse, the whole phrase was changed. And this is a historical fact. It originally said B'nai Elua. It got changed from that to B'nai Yisrael, or Yasharal, if you prefer. That word is still Yasharal. It doesn't matter what version of Hebrew you look at on your app. That word got changed. It got changed from one Hebrew word to another Hebrew word. And that's a corruption. That has nothing to do with the language. That's just a corruption. That's scribes changing words. And, you know, so I mean, scholars have even known this for years now, that the Masoretic has changed things. Or they're using manuscripts that have changed things. Whatever the Masoretes had was corrupted modern Hebrew manuscripts, and most people date whatever the Masoretes had back to the 2nd century. So before roughly 200 AD, you did not have these variants. You did not have these changes. So that's why the Vulgate, you can look at a Catholic Bible, no less, and see where things have changed. Because the Catholic Bible is using something that the Masoretic would have had to depend on. The Masoretic, all those codexes the Masoretic uses did not exist in the 3rd century. So whatever they're using for their codexes, like the Westminster, Leningrad, any of those had to use what the Vulgate used, most likely, if I was to guess. The Vulgate, Jerome, he was friends with some rabbis. He most likely used a 2nd century corruption for his Vulgate. That's why there's a lot of similarities. What's interesting, though, is back then, there's still stuff that agrees with the Septuagint back then in the Vulgate, in the Hebrew text he used. So there were still remnants of the original Hebrew text in their early corruption. So what it seems like has happened, kind of like how the Father's name kept getting corrupted all the way until it started becoming Jehovah. It's kind of what has happened to the Hebrew text at this point. It's been a little change here, a little change there. 500 years later, 600 years later, 1,000 years later. So by the time you get the Masoretic text, it's highly corrupted. It's not just a little bit. It's highly. So I would say, I would encourage people even to do their own study with testing the Vulgate, because the Vulgate will show you where they have changed the Hebrew text they had to get what they have. Because I'll just give you like 2 examples before we go here, just to show you what I'm talking about. This is 2 examples I always show people. I look into the Vulgate. Okay, these are 2 messianic prophecies that the Vulgate has almost word for word with the LXX. So I'll just show you here how, even though the Vulgate has a corrupted text, it's not as corrupted as the Masoretic. So go to Genesis 49:10, right? A scepter from Judah and a leader from his thigh will not be taken away until he who will be sent arrives. Doesn't say Shiloh.
Right.
And
right.
he will be the expectation of the Gentiles.
Mm-hmm.
That phrase, expectation of the Gentiles, can only be found in the Septuagint. So this means that the Vulgate is using a Hebrew text that is a little bit closer to Septuagint. Let me see what's another one here I could use to show you guys. Let's go with Jeremiah. I think 11:19 is the Lamb verse. I'm trying to remember if it's Jeremiah or Zechariah. It might be Zechariah. I always get these 2 confused when I look at the wood into his bread verse. What is it? Oh. This is weird. Oh, here we go. Yep. I was like a meek lamb who was carried to be a victim. And I did not realize that they had devised plans against me, saying, let us place wood upon his bread. That's the crucifixion.
Yeah.
Okay? So
Yeah.
the Vulgate, mind you, has the crucifixion in there. So does the Septuagint. Let us put wood into his bread.
Yeah.
So again, it's not bad enough that the Hebrew, the Masoretic text is using a corrupted Hebrew text. They were probably changing whatever source they had already had in there, because you got a couple of verses that the Vulgate agrees with the Septuagint. So, and the Vulgate, trust me, did not have the original Hebrew. So that means slowly, the Paleo-Hebrew scriptures was being distorted and corrupted by the Masoretic stream, not the Septuagint stream, the Masoretic stream. So that should be a bigger issue, is that even if you look at the stream of modern Hebrew texts, they deviate from the original Hebrew so much, especially if you look at the more modern ones. Now, if you look at the Aramaic, Targums, you look at the Peshitas, they're a lot closer to the original. If you look at the Vulgate, even certain areas are closer to the original Hebrew. But anyway, so hopefully that was for someone. And as I always say, guys, open your Bible, read your scriptures. Okay. Shabbat shalom, everyone. and enjoy the rest of Yahuwah Shabbat.